Okay, I think most of you have it by now. Thank you very much, Vanessa and Daniela. It's an honor to be included in this intriguing and multidimensional project. My task is to say something to you about the status of the image in the early modern period, late medieval and early modern period, and I'll get to that in a few minutes. But I wanted to begin by reflecting briefly on what I think the project as a whole might be about. I would identify tentatively three modes of visual history, or maybe better, three possible building blocks or components of a pictorial history. And I would call those monuments, evidence, and dreams. Monuments, evidence, and dreams. And by dreams I mean invented or imagined depictions, even if they draw sometimes upon evidence. By monuments I mean deliberately constructed artifacts constructed by a community or a society in order to archive and publish a version of their own past. You could call it planted evidence. Planted evidence. Monument is a proleptic piece of evidence. It's meant to be easily legible, in fact unmistakable, in fact very imperiously manipulative form of evidence that is meant to go off like a time bomb later when someone comes across it. That's the first category. And the second is evidence. Evidence is a trace or a sample, a relic, an index of a world, of a infinity of experiences, which is come across later and could be described as something like an unintended monument. Right? Societies learn to read these found objects, traces of the past, as if they were registering that past. They're unintentional monuments, as it were. And the third are what I call dreams, depictions or imagined narratives of the past. And visual, these dreams, as dreams tend to do, are often structured narratively. And they would come closest to fulfilling the, let's say, meeting the metaphorical terms of writing implied in the Ars Historica that Peter Miller was just discussing. In other words, Peter was telling us that history is only sometimes, the concept of history, the metaphor of history is only sometimes appropriate because when antiquarians assemble constellations or albums of artifacts, they're not really telling a narrative. They're simply laying the objects out, displaying them, and inviting you to piece them together, right? And it's the same often for the presentation of the unintended monuments, the evidence. But when the picture tells a story, when someone invents a story, it tells a narrative, right? Then we come to converge upon the terms of the metaphor, and we might talk about something properly like pictorial history. And I think that's what, if I understand correctly, primarily Vanessa and Daniela are interested in. Now these three categories play roles in different phases of, let's say, civilization. There are moments when societies narrate, display, or publish their own preferred history, their heroic history, let's say, their epic history, in artifacts and images. That's when they create monuments, or Denkmäler, the Germans would say. And a paradigm would be the Egyptian pharaohs making pyramids, for example. Right? These are the intentional monuments. There's another phase when societies start to become interested in monuments created by other societies, right? It's natural to be interested in the monuments created by what you perceive to be your own community or society. But when you start to become interested in the monuments created by other societies, right, or by, let's say, your own past, but felt now to be discontinuous, that's history as such. I'll go out and say it. That's history as such. And Herodotus, the Greek historian, taking interest in the Egyptian pyramids, is a historian. Right? He's interested in someone else's monuments. And then there's yet a third phase, which even Herodotus had not yet arrived at, and that's when you realize that even non-monumental relics of the past are valuable evidence of a vanished life world, precisely because they were not intentional, because they were not fashioned as monuments. They're more reliable, more authoritative. And that leads to the disciplines that we were just hearing about, archaeology and antiquarianism. And this is modern history, right? So first you make your own history, second you come across someone else's history, and third you interpret potentially any relic as a monument. And you suddenly have this possibility of piecing together, constellating, displaying images and artifacts, found objects, relics, and samples, including images and pictures. That is to say, artifacts which have been highly stylized, right, and could be described as speaking artifacts. And that complicates the reading of them as evidence. It's one thing to come across a weapon or a fragment of a piece of ancient furniture, but it's another to come across a painting or a relief sculpture that tells a story. And to read them, let's say a relief sculpture, as evidence means really to learn to read it against itself, to impose upon it a counter story, counter to the one that it's itself proposing. Now, at any point in this notional, abstract sequence of stages that I just laid out, the past can also be pictured or dreamed. And the locus classicus for such a picturing of the past is the first lengthy passage on my handout, and that's the passage from the first book of Virgil's Aeneid, written around 20 BC, which many of you are familiar with. And I've offered you a literal translation of this passage. Not my translation, but it's one I found that purports to be just more or less a word-by-word translation. And this is when Aeneas, who has fled Troy, right? I know you're all Trojans, so that was part of the idea here. He and his band of refugees from the sacked city of Troy have been wandering the Mediterranean for 6 years, and they land in Carthage. Carthage had recently been settled. This is mythic history. Carthage had recently been settled, according to the Aeneid, by refugees from Tyre, the city of Tyre, now in Lebanon. These are Phoenicians, and they were building under their queen Dido a great city in Carthage. For at the foot of the great temple, Aeneas is biding his time waiting for Dido to appear. For at the foot of the great temple, surveying things one at a time, while he was marveling at what fortunes the city had, the hands of craftsmen, the work and labor among them, from a line, it's a bit obscure sounding, but just there, from the line, the Trojan battles and wars in fame now spread through the whole world. The Atreides and Priam and Achilles savage to both. He stopped and crying said, "What place now, Achates," his companion, "what region in the world is not full of our labors?" You see? Because the Phoenicians, right, the Carthaginians, have decided to build, evidently what we understand from this passage, build into the base of their own temple, right, a series of monumental reliefs narrating in pictures, right, the story of the Trojan War. It's not their own history. This is extraordinary. This is the drama of the passages that Aeneid realizes that his story is now being recognized, right, already by other cultures, only 6 years later, as a universal story, a story that belongs to all mankind, right? And this brings his tears. Even here, there are its own rewards for glory. There are the tears of things, sunt lacrimae rerum, the famous patches, and mortal things touch the mind. He goes on, he spoke thus and grazed his spirit with the empty picture, right? That's a key phrase. Pictura inani means vain, worthless, or empty picture. So this is very important because he's downplaying the materiality of the picture, right? He's not stressing that this is a splendid bronze relief that is registering the wealth and the power of this. He's saying this is, I think, grist to your mill for your program. He's saying that these pictures are as intrinsically worthless as words. They're nothing. I look right through them. I don't care if they're made of bronze. What I care about is the meaning they deliver, the story they tell. I'm reading the history. He knows the history. He was there. But he now knows that everyone else can read this history, and this history is written in a instantly legible, immediate, no longer linguistic, and therefore no longer bound by conventions, a universal language, which is the securest guarantee of an eternal fame. And everyone who visits Tyre, no matter what language they speak, will be able to understand, as long as there's some initial key, some label that says, this is about Troy. And once you go from there, you can start to piece together the story. For He was watching as Troy was battling around in this. It's a bit garbled here. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but it's essentially a potted version of the Trojan War. Finally, down at the bottom of the page, he also recognizes himself. So he's already appearing in this narrative, mingling with the leaders of the Greeks and the Eastern Lights. Now, it's crucial that this is not a, when you think of the Roman reliefs of his own time, say, Augustan times, or a little bit later, let's say, with Trajanic reliefs, which are often not narrative. They're much more diagrammatic. They're a series of portraits, or they're rulers involved in some kind of ritual or a procession. Here, they're engaged in a very complex battle scene, and yet remain recognizable. And then to turn the page, then to end this long passage. While these things seemed wonderful to Dardanian Aeneas, and while he was dazed, he hangs fixed on one view. Right, so he's, despite his claim that it's just that this is really just a kind of efficient delivery system for stories and truths, he actually ends up getting attached to certain aspects. There's some, there are some, let's say, denser points in the narrative that may have to do with the artistry. So there are all hints of that in Virgil's account, right? Such depictions, such dreams, I would say, because the craftsmen who carved these reliefs were not at Troy, right? They had to imagine, right? They're presumably translating an oral account of the war into these reliefs. This is a work of art, right? These are works of art. And what are works of art? A work of art is an image that acquiesces in the dream work of the image. That is to say, it does not fight against the tendency of images to transform the real, to render the real unfamiliar, to render the real opaque, or to displace the real into symbolic or allegorical dimensions, right? An image that does not fight against its own tendency to do that, and I'm asserting that images have that tendency, is a work of art. A work of art is an image that now generates meaning and no longer simply delivers meaning. The implication is that the modern artist, or really any artist, right, even the Carthaginian artist, even if he wants to archive the past, even if his intention is to archive and publicize the past, right, must fail, right? That the artwork, right, in any medium will transform the object. I came across a passage just the other day from Kingsley Amis. It's not in one of his novels, it's in an interview where he says, someone complained that I put a real restaurant into my novel. And he says, well, once it's in my novel, it's no longer real. It may bear the same name of the restaurant that you know, but just the simple translation of the real into the institution of the novel warps it and distorts it and defamiliarizes it. And that's the essence of art. Now let's look at the next quote, which comes from the 18th century. It's from D'Argenville, who's a pioneering, although not original art historian. He's a compiler, really, of 3-volume Lives of the Most Famous Painters, which he began in 1745. And in his preface, he says, right, I'll read the translation, "What is more grand than to express in a mute language the works of the Creator, to preserve the memory of the past, to immortalize a hero, to illustrate a nation?" So he justifies his attention to the history of art, the history of painting. He's talking about Renaissance and Baroque painting, basically, by saying that these were historians. They were in fact carrying out a noble form of history, and they deserve this kind of secondary presentation or exposition that is what an art history does. He's saying really that there's no reason for me to add any contextual interpretation of these works, because these works themselves are already, in effect, delivering their context. They're interpreting their own context. And now let's compare this text to one that was written only a little over a century later by Baudelaire. This is a text I only came across, again, just the other day, and have not sought out a translation for it yet. There must be a standard translation. It's a late and brief essay by Baudelaire called L'Art Philosophique. I'll just translate it live, as it were. He's saying the opposite of D'Argenville. Right? D'Argenville, therefore, must represent the end of a trajectory, the end of a tradition of thinking of paintings as fundamentally writing history, right? And Baudelaire saying that era is over. What is the pure art? What is pure art according to the modern conception? It is to create a suggestive magic containing at the same time the object and the subject, the exterior world, the world exterior to the artist, and the artist himself. What is philosophical art according to the conception of Chenavard, who was a French artist of the time, and the German school? It is a plastic art which has the pretension of replacing the book, that is to say, to rival with the printing press for teaching history, morals, and philosophy. Then he says, there are in fact epochs of history where the plastic arts, painting, sculpture, are destined to paint the historical archives of a people and its religious beliefs. But for several centuries now, it is the case that in the history of art, there is a separation more and more marked of powers. There are subjects which belong to painting, and there are others to music, and others to literature. Okay? Baudelaire is saying that modern art is no longer, can no longer, should no longer serve as the archive of a collective mentality. It's doing something completely different. Let me turn now to the problem of the image. What do images, and Baudelaire, I think, leads into this question, what do images or pictures show? What do they do? And I'm going to treat it first ahistorically before we ask the question of what the image was in the early modern period. I do resist a little bit the total historicization of the image. I think, of course, every society, every culture, every epoch had its image, but there are dimensions of the image which are transhistorical. I think images are and always have been valued because they seem to offer certain immediacy and presence. The Germans have a word for this. It's evidence, which we translate as self-evidence. That is to say, what you see is what you get. There's no further interpretation necessary. And that's certainly part of the rhetoric of images. The ancients and the early modern rhetoricians had a word for this, a rhetorical term, enargeia, which meant the capacity to vividly show, vividly evoke an absent complex. Images are seen as, we've said this already, material samples, indexes, or evidence of a vanished world that are capable of cutting through the web of texts. And that was the appeal for many of the archaeologists and antiquarians who were tired of the repetition and the cribbing and copying and corruption of the chains and networks of texts. And they saw that the image had a capacity to slice through all that. On the other hand, at the same time that images are valued, they are mistrusted. They are mistrusted as evidence because they arrest, they suspend, right? They artificially still reality. They have difficulty representing dynamic change and movement. They represent a pause, an epoche. They condense and they displace, and that's why the image was crucial to Freud's concept of the dream work. Right? That the dream does its work by condensing and displacing the complexity of reality, right? Which makes it untrustworthy as a certain kind of evidence, but only within the terms of psychoanalysis, extremely valuable as another form of evidence. So it seems like in order to handle the image, we're going to have to develop entirely different notions of how to read and how to interpret them. The image is also untrustworthy because it is mobile in time. It is anachronistic or anachronic. And I want to just call attention to that last quote on the handout from Gertrude Bing. And I quote her only to refute her. Gertrude Bing was the colleague of Aby Warburg, his Viennese colleague, and essentially after his death, the curator of his legacy and his writings. And late in her life, in 1957, she said, Aby Warburg and Fritz Saxel, who was Warburg's much less imaginative collaborator, a great art historian, but not on Warburg's level, showed, quote, that images were not less secure guides to the actions, notions, and states of mind of those who use them than written documents. Okay? Not less secure guides to mentalities than written documents. Where I would have thought that Aby Warburg showed us just the opposite, that they are much less reliable, much less secure guides to mentalities than written text, or maybe as equally, as insecure guides as written text, because they are labile, they are always escaping their historical anchoring, pointing backwards and forwards, drifting and hurtling through time. The image, in other words, Warburg found different ways to say this, and Bing would have denied it, but I would say that the image is already, in some sense, an artwork. Any image is already tending in that direction, towards a kind of intrinsic untimeliness, opacity, allegorical quality, an enigmatic, self-contradictory quality. Qua art, an image reveals truths unknown even to the person who made it. They know better. And we have to ask, what kind of evidence is this? Baudelaire reminded us it's exactly this, and Bing denied it. To conclude, I just want to speak briefly about what the image was in the late medieval, early modern period. There were two technological developments, and they have to do with reproduction or replication, right? Two new technologies, or technes, let's say, know-hows. One was the reproduction of the appearance of the world, right? And that developed primarily in the 15th century, both in Northern and in Southern Europe, talking about descriptive painting, the ability to describe in paint with high degree of persuasiveness the appearance of things, right? And second, the mechanical reproduction or replication of images, that is to say, image-to-image replication. I'm talking about woodcuts and engravings. And these two technologies of reproduction, one of them is image-to-world and the other is image-to-image, emerged simultaneously, and I believe in dialectic with one another. Okay? Replicas, as you all know, create origins. Right? It's the replica that points us to an origin that we didn't know was its origin before. In that sense, descriptive painting of the Renaissance helped create the idea of nature, or the natural object, the natural specimen, right? And likewise, it's the print, the woodcut of engraving, that created the idea of the original work of art. It created the split, the hierarchy between an original work of art and a mere copy. And both of these technologies played important roles in the shifts underway in this period. They, in fact, I believe, drove these shifts with respect to several questions regarding the image. The question of the image's authority, right? The question of the image's legibility, the question of the image's capacity to communicate, also raising the question of whether images ever do communicate, or do they sometimes not communicate at all? What are they if they don't communicate? Are they sometimes simply present, right? And fourth, the question of the image's reference, which was my initial title, but ends up being a small shout out at this point. What are images connected in any robust way, in any rigorous way, to something in reality? Are there any ways that images can refer, that is to say, point decisively and unambiguously to something in the world, the way language sometimes can? I'm distinguishing here between reference and signification. Signification is the generation of meaning. Reference is the direct pointing to something in the world. Right? It's not quite the same thing. The question of the image's authority is, does the image ever underwrite claims made in the real world? Right? Material evidence has the power to challenge textual tradition, but it's heavily dependent on labeling. Right? It's heavily dependent on that initial labeling that we discussed with reference to the Aeneas fresco relief, and it is highly manipulable. Right? The question of the image's legibility, then again, what knowledge or information does one need? What envelope of discourse does one need before being capable of receiving its message? Right? I think I must be about out of time, Vanessa, before I launch into another topic, according to my calculations. It's a complex alarm system you have there.
40 seconds.
Yeah,
So
so
1 minute and 40 seconds.
yeah, there's no point, I think, trying to compress another unit. So I will stop there. Thank you.